Okay, in this lecture, we're going to discuss global inequality. Again, we've been talking largely about inequality within a single nation, generally ours. But we also need to recognize that the world is also divided up into rich and poor nations. And typically, for a very long time, we used some outdated terms. We talked about first world, second world, third world. We're often very familiar with the first and last of those terms, first world. We often use the hashtag first world problems, usually when we're referring to things like, my $800, smartphone doesn't have good Wi-Fi reception, or my $6 latte is cold, right? We hashtag first world problems. So we're usually referring that term when we usually think about first world. We think about the rich nations in the world. And third world, we're very familiar with that kind of concept of poor nations, imagery of poverty and starvation and hunger, those kind of things. So I sometimes question students, where's the second world that we never hear about? And it's because those terms largely, and again, mini history lesson here, derive from following World War II. We started examining the nations of the world in one of kind of three, basically based on alliances. Right after World War II, the two superpowers largely that were left were the United States and the Soviet Union, and they formed political alliances with other countries. And we tended to think of the first world as the United States and its allies, and we tended to think of the second world as the Soviet Union and its allies, and then the third world is kind of everywhere else. And it was kind of based on those political alliances or military alliances that those terms were coined. Of course, that lost a lot of its relevance in the early 1990s when the Soviet Union ceased to become a nation of its own. But we still kind of fell in. Then we started thinking about, the first world are the most industrialized nations in the world, the most quote unquote advanced as far as production. And then we fell into this notion of calling the middle countries the industrializing nations, those who were attempting to industrialize, and then the third world as being the least industrialized nations. That's somewhat lost its relevance only because there's so much confusion as to what makes a nation industrialized and what's not. The United States, we can clearly actually imagine ourselves as post-industrial, so that we've actually kind of quote unquote progressed beyond the notion of being an industrial country into post-industrial, what's called an information society. So largely now, the terms that are most used are the global north and the global south. Okay, so maybe paring it down a little too simply, and again, not purely based on geography, but what we consider to be the richest, most wealthy nations in the world, for the most part, are located above the equator. That's generally considered the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe, Japan, to a lesser degree. And now below the equator, there is Australia and New Zealand, which are also considered part of the global north, despite the fact that they're not in the northern hemisphere. And then the global south is largely considered most other countries in the world that are considered less affluent than now. People will say, well, what about China? What about Russia? Where do those nations fit in? There are very much more complicated ways of ranking this, but usually when we talk about those, we talk about those. China is definitely fulfilling its role right now as being one of the largest producers of industrial or manufactured goods in the world, which is why wherever you buy things at Walmart or wherever else you're doing your shopping, almost inevitably most of the things we purchase that are manufactured come from China. India, with the nation with the world's largest population right now, has largely given itself over to a large degree to the service industry. So again, we sometimes wonder why, when we call it for technical assistance, or anything like that, phones are being answered. So there's lots of different variations on this, but for the most part, the global north and the global south are the big divisions that we make. Again, we sometimes think about how this came to be. Again, not to get too much into history here, but most of this is a legacy of colonialism, which again, in the most of the 19th and 20th centuries, those countries that are able to industrialize the fastest also became the most powerful as far as military power. And for the most part, they went around the world just taking over other places to exploit them for their resources and, in a lot of cases, labor. And while we can certainly say that the legacy of colonialism certainly exhibits itself today, even though most colonies have either been granted or fought for their independence as nations, um, that a lot of those remnants of that colonial legacy still exist. Um, Again, many people make the case that the third world is not underdeveloped, what we sometimes call the third world, the global south, but overexploited. So it's just the idea that many of the, think about what we talked about in a society with the elite interests are for the global south and those countries which produce mainly natural resources and cheap labor to remain that way and not challenge their position. Again, we can sometimes talk about foreign debt, which is sometimes called neo-colonialism, a new form of colonialism, that the global south nations owe the nations of the global north billions of dollars. They're in debt, and as many of us know, when you're in debt to somebody, that puts them in an incredible position of power over you. That nations that are in debt often have to adapt what are called austerity measures, which means that they can't spend as much money as they might normally on things like infrastructure or social welfare programs within their own country because they're busy paying off debt and especially interest on debt to many of the nations of the global north. So again, their own citizens are suffering because the nations are in debt to other countries. And again, sometimes people refer to neo-colonialism as even more effective form of control over these nations than colonialism was. Colonialism, if you took over a country with military power, you had to continuously invest money into maintaining that power. You had to maintain a government, you had to maintain a military, and it cost money to have a colony, not to say that it didn't pay back in big dividends. But the modern criticism, and there's a quote from your text, control through debt not only requires no infrastructure, but actually makes people pay for their own oppression. So many of the nations of the global south, through these incredible rates of interest that they have to accumulate, are basically paying to be controlled. We definitely know that, again, corporations around the world, largely founded in and mostly representing the interests of nations of the global north. It's not just the United States. Again, if I were to say Sony to you, you would probably equate that with Japan. If I were to say BMW, Germany. So we definitely know that many of the world's largest corporations are founded in and probably serving the interests of these global north nations. And again, what we talk about is this concept of, okay, what do they want? They want cheap labor, cheap resources, and markets in which to sell their products. And by doing so, they can, like I said, often corporate interests run up against the interests of what we would call the global south and third world countries. In fact, we've definitely seen political action on behalf of corporations to make corporates more marketable. So we saw this in the United States, interventions in places like Iran and Cuba to maintain and perpetuate corporate interests. Another problem sometimes facing these third world nations is calculation of what we call gross domestic product, or GDP. For the most part, this is a measure of the wealth that's transferred in and out of a nation. So the amount of wealth that changes hands in a nation. So when a nation does a lot of commerce and has a booming economy, it has a very high gross domestic product, or GDP, right? And what that means for a nation like the United States that engages in lots and lots and lots of trade, not only with other nations but within, we can constantly measure our economic health by how much wealth is being transferred, and it's an enormous amount. So the more a nation spends, not only within its borders, outside, the GDP goes up. And the rankings of GDPs are often the ways that nations kind of compare and contrast themselves. And clearly, if a nation is not producing very much, it's considered to have a very low GDP and is then considered to be, quote unquote, a poor country. The problem with this is there's no distinction in these countries about what's good and bad spending, right? It's just the amount of money that transfers. So a nation that is wrestling with this concept of being a poor nation and doesn't want to be considered that might consider, take Brazil for example, which houses the world's largest rainforest in the Amazon. A good way to spend money is to cut down the Amazon, right? Continuously develop that land. Well, that's not good for Brazil. It's not good for the world. But if they want to, quote unquote, get their GDP up, it's something that they feel like they must need to do. So many people have pointed to the idea that GDP calculation is not only harmful for many countries, but doesn't take into account many things which should be taken into human existence, which don't calculate well. Things like taking care of children, right? It's not a calculation that fits anyway into GDP at all. Conservation of resources, being able to protect things like the Amazon rainforest, which is good for the planet and good for humanity, is not taken into account when calculating GDP. There's been a push toward maybe another thing some people have recommended, something called the Happy Planet Index. And again, I put this resource in the module so you can take a look at it. But this concept of measuring things that actually contribute to human existence, right? And basically the last time that the Happy Planet Index, was applied to the majority of nations of the world, it was calculated that we are actually a very unhappy planet. Thank you.